Hey there, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And at some point as a critic, you got to acknowledge that the discourse will stop being about the music and becomes about, well, everything else. And most critics will acknowledge that, and then plow forward anyway in their piece, and it becomes intensely obvious in the review that they got a much larger axe to grind. Or they are much more interested in talking about, well, everything else besides the music, especially if the music isn't much worth caring about. And the last time I made a video like this, it was about Katy Perry and 143 from 2024, and really the backlash to that album that felt very disproportionate to how thoroughly mediocre it was. Now, was it a veiled call out of the audience and some cultural commentators who should really know better? Well, yeah, duh, of course it was. You know who you are. But that's not what this is gonna be. And again, it's not going to be a review. Truth be told, if you go back to 2016 and my review of Views, you can plainly tell in the phenomenon of Drake in popular culture, it's interested me a lot more than any of the actual music, which has been mediocre outside of isolated flashes for coming up on a decade now. And going back to that review, you can tell how much of a chore it was even back then. Hell, my review of Certified Lover Boy in 2021, it was less review and more extended cultural commentary amidst the feud with Kanye West and how they really often felt like two sides of the same coin. And yet, in 2025, somehow every divergence point makes both of them look worse simultaneously. It's why both of his 2022 albums were reviewed in short form, and why my review of For All the Dogs in 2023 was more observant in how the backlash had finally started catching up with him. And yet, in the aftermath of Drake's feud with Kendrick Lamar that shook so much of hip-hop to its very core in 2024, and it was fascinating going back through my old reviews and finding out just how much I had called this conflict nearly a decade ago, I mentioned it in passing discussing Views. Paradoxically, this could have been the opportunity that Drake needed to snap out of the cycle of garbage, get to something better, where in a perverse way, I could have imagined this album working, not so much putting Drake back on top. I don't think this album was ever built for that, but maybe a level set, allowing Drake to find a pathway forward. No jokes here. There were folks that I spoke to in Toronto over the past 8 or so months where we tried to figure out what Drake had needed to do in order to make a passable album, where a PartyNextDoor collaboration even made some sense. But after listening to Some Sexy Songs for You, what we wound up getting were 4 big reasons why it might take something even more drastic for Drake to ever have a chance of recovery, because at this point, it goes well and truly beyond the music. Let's start off with a category that matters the least in reality, but probably a little bit more to Drake than he will ever admit. He's proven willing to take pot shots at music critics down to showing up in Anthony Fantano's DMs, behavior that was so corny that Anthony tried to throw him a bone by pretending Drake had sent him a vegan cookie recipe, and that incident always struck me as kind of wild. Artists shoot at critics all the time. It's part of the general procedure here. But Drake is one of the biggest and most successful acts of the past 15 years, rich and powerful and connected beyond his wildest dreams. Why on earth was he seeking validation from YouTube critics, or Twitch streamers, or podcasters, or really anyone? Well, let's start off by acknowledging something that many of us from the very beginning had recognized. Coming out of the late 2000s in rap music, Drake was not treated with much in the way of respect. A child actor from Canada who acted on Degrassi, who may have gotten Lil Wayne's cosign when Wayne was the hottest rapper alive in the mid-2000s, but there was a limit to how seriously you initially took Drake. Hell, at Young Money, I remember a lot more hip-hop heads talking up Nicki Minaj way more seriously than they ever took Drake, and that wasn't surprising per se. Her come up was in New York, so she kind of built groundswell with New York radio and that underground. She was a spitter, which back then way too many people thought was a novelty coming from a woman, and there was a real dearth of women in mainstream rap at the time. And when you couple it with the fact that Drake also marketed himself around R&B as a more sensitive figure, the easiest punchlines in the world from any sort of music commentator were laughing at how soft and unthreatening Drake was. And for a while it seemed like Drake was willing to be in on the joke, so long as it got him into the right rooms. And not for nothing, The music was often very good to even great. So Far Gone is a strong mixtape that's aged surprisingly well, and it becomes easy to ignore Thank Me Later and all of its dated messiness when Take Care actually dodged the sophomore slump and Nothing Was the Same is his best album. Yes, I'm standing on that one, even despite the presence of Started from the Bottom. Now, this won Drake a lot of critical acclaim, and not just from predominantly white audiences that unironically use the term PBR&B. The industry push was there, sure, but even among some die-hard hip-hop purists, Drake had made some slight inroads, especially with the Meek Mill beef, and if you're reading this, it's too late in 2015. An album I paradoxically like and dislike more with every passing year. And Drake relished that attention and the acclaim, especially within the culture as he fancied himself a student of the game. This was the boy who idolized the underground scene in America, and many of the MCs that would never give him the time of day, certainly not as much respect as he was giving them, and that created a weird dichotomy. For rappers who didn't have that commercial crossover, Drake was accessible enough for the cosign, maybe even a breakthrough, if you were willing to stand next to him. And that's been true for dozens of rappers, singers, and producers over the years. What became apparent is that Drake really craved validation, less from critics but contemporaries and hip-hop gatekeepers alike. You can argue whether it was a mistake that the gatekeepers let him in the first place, or why they let him in. Were they asleep at the wheel in the aftermath of the ringtone era, a real down point for mainstream rap? Or had they lost so much power in the commercialization and the lack of regionalism of mainstream rap that they couldn't effectively stop him? Or that there was enough clout or big enough OGs or executives behind him like Jay Prince and Lucian Grange that would make your life, let's say, difficult if you tried to stop him? Or was he making some of them so much money that they compromised all of their standards and integrity and looked the other way? Or did Drake present himself as so non-threatening that they didn't recognize what they got into before it was far too late? If you treat him like a joke, it's not like you're compromising your principles or integrity that much, right? Now, truthfully, I don't think there's a straightforward answer across the board here. It's probably a combination of all of this. But I also don't want to ascribe conspiracy when I think the more interesting question comes with why Drake got critical acclaim in the first place. And I think the answer is vulnerability. Key to his success in R&B as a non-traditional singer, not coming up in gospel or jazz or soul, so much of Drake's appeal was speaking to the counterpoint to the hyper-machismo of the 2000s. For men who had that sensitive side and who hadn't gone away, but also for dudes who could slip into insecurity or make bad or complicating decisions, especially in and around women. And here's the thing. You might not like that Drake became the face of that brand of introspection, especially if you were deeper into hip-hop and R&B and knew that there was a substantial number of acts that did this just as well, if not better, going deeper, sometimes stylistically, sometimes in their content. Hell, I don't like that Drake became the face of this, and it's criminal how many online say that Drake created all of this, as if LL Cool J and Lil Brother and Fonte and even Joe Budden laid some of this template, where Drake wound up getting all the credit from people who really don't know any better and who don't want to know any better. But I also understand why it worked. For a whole generation of guys who could empathize with that questioning insecurity while finding some veneer of cool and some really striking and atmospheric production, and he had just enough talent to be mostly credible, well, it makes sense for multiple generations to embrace him. For the irony-poisoned Gen X, they probably would laugh the hardest at Drake for being soft and messy, but also with enough ironic to deflection in order to praise him while still maintaining a veneer of cool. And for millennials like myself, well, okay, if you're talking about a generation who were, in general, more earnest, more willing to be open and honest about their feelings to the annoyance of, well, everyone else, with wide enough framing to place all of it on display and not fully absolve himself so there was some complexity, hell, Drake works like a charm. And it wasn't just him. J. Cole's whole appeal was being structured around being the everyman college dude who also had some of that messy vulnerability and insecurity and real flaws. Hell, was the reason that Future's R&B side has worked at all for the past decade, because he indulged in the most toxic and nihilistic wish fulfillment imaginable, but was also still pleading for love. There was no detachment from plunging into that abyss. Same with The Weeknd. Hell, step outside of rap or R&B R&B and ask yourself, what's Taylor Swift's fundamental appeal that's been able to speak to women for decades and now with playing to that same sort of relatability and all of her flaws and insecurities? And speaking of women, this is when Drake built so much of that fan base and who often became his biggest defenders, black women specifically. He was sensitive, he was approachable, he seemed to be introspective, he featured black women on his albums, he was trying to be romantic, even if every swing for Rihanna looked more pathetic than the last. And let's not act like there weren't people invested in that possible connection, especially when Chris Brown's reputation was in the toilet and he tried to fight Drake about it in 2012. At least Drake was building his brand on being the nice guy, and it often goes overlooked how much it worked, especially in contrast to years of guys in mainstream rap who didn't want to or seemingly even know how to express their feelings beyond base machismo. And not for nothing, stepping outside of the music, if a guy presents himself as approachable or introspective and he happens to be a little bit witty or talented, have his life put together, that happens to work for a lot of women. Yeah, there's a natural suspicion when it comes across as inauthentic or more lip service than action, but it's a hell of a lot more common sense than the majority of shit vomited out as advice to young men these days. But again, around the mid-2010s, the branding of the nice guy started curdling, and where it became obvious Drake's worst enemy might have been himself.
Yeah. I was running through the six with my woes.
I tend to think that around 2015, the veneers around Drake's image started slipping and slipping hard, and I'm not sure there's a single inciting incident. You can point at the Meek Mill beef where it got exposed that Drake used ghostwriters, and while that permanently knocked him off a pedestal in the hip-hop purist who had grudgingly valued some of his pen, it also exposed to a wide audience it didn't seem to matter. He and the commercial machine just churned out hits, and he won the internet for the folks where artistic integrity mattered a lot less than the drama, than the gossip, than the memes, and is it your tour or your girl's tour? Now there's a lot more behind the Meek Mill story than I care to get into, a not insignificant portion of it in questionable legality, which is the secret truth behind all rap beef that tends to go a little bit too far. If you know, you know. But it was a victory where Drake was feeling himself. Then he had What a Time to Be Alive, his collab album with Future, another project that's aged weirdly with me for with more appreciation of Future and less of this era of Drake. And with all the more ego and vibes on display, well, it was kind of curdling. Then Hotline Bling happened and was a massive hit. And while there was some noise about him swiping Cha-Cha from Drum, not the first time Drake would get pinged with appropriating music that first belonged to someone else, it largely got drowned out because of memes and it made the people dance. It's not like he was a threat or anything. Then came Views, where the reviews were mixed, but it brought Drake his first lead #1 single with One Dance and sparked the cultural appropriation discussion with him adopting the Jamaican accent and the slang, but it largely got brushed aside because of Toronto's Caribbean population. And it also spurred plenty of memes and other hits, but also sidelong glances that Drake overexposure was starting to indeed be a thing, where especially in Toronto, you started hearing these weird rumors about Drake, especially from women. He might have put the 6 on the map, but at what cost? But I'd argue, at least in Toronto, having lived here at the time, the cracks were forming, especially in his ties to the city's music scene. Yeah, he put The Weeknd on, but by 2015, Abel was a superstar in his own right, and the bad blood between him and Drake was very obvious to those in the know, especially locally if you happen to have any underground connections. There was also real tension between him and Tory Lanez around that time as well. Can't say anyone really won with that one. Could have afforded a little more collateral damage if we're being honest. But most importantly to the story, PartyNextDoor saw his crossover breakthrough in 2016. And this is where I might as well mention him. I guess he's part of Some Sexy Songs for You as well. If I sound dismissive, well, it's because I am. I don't like PartyNextDoor. I never really have. His lethargic moaning has always struck me as a less lyrical and less engaging version of what Drake did better. A derivative and underpowered wannabe where I don't think I have liked a single charting song from him in a decade plus of putting him in Billboard Breakdown. And in the mid-2010s, when a lot of artists were really trying to copy Drake, especially in Toronto, PartyNextDoor may have gotten the OVO signing, but he was never going to be be good enough to actually surpass his label boss. But his sound was also just close enough to Drake, and it charted long enough that it only heightened that feeling of overexposure, but it was also telling that Drake was surrounding himself with people, especially on his label, that weren't about to surpass him even for a moment. It's hard to foster and grow talent, make no mistake, it's hard to get a label off the ground, but it's also a sign of insecurity that you can't keep excellent people around you. And that's before you kept hearing rumors of relationships that Drake had burned in the meantime, men or women, and yet a lot of them always seemed to involve women who were in other relationships. And from men that normally didn't seem to have conflict with anyone. But the sad thing is that more often than not, a lot of it was local, or it was within industry circles. The internet was a lot broader and rarely, if ever, focused on some of those smaller moments. And while Drake's sensitive image was bleeding away amidst every accent he hopped on, with every patronizing song he made around women, that whole declaration of love towards Rihanna, which she soundly rejected at the VMAs in 2016, did not help. I also blame Child's Play as one of the worst Drake songs ever that for some asinine reason got a video. But as the mid-2010s became the late 2010s, while there was pushback brewing in many corners, it often felt like it wasn't really sticking. The thing about being so vulnerable in your art to the point where it becomes integral to your persona is at some point, especially if you amass enough commercial power and clout, it allows a certain shamelessness. You can say and do things that might go beyond the pale for any other act, and it becomes excused because it's who you are. You've already admitted it. Who can stop you when you have already every excuse in the chamber? Now that deeper framing and introspection, that's just for nerds who dig in the details, who are just hating that they could not do the same. They don't have the aura or that energy to excuse everything you do, where the power becomes its own reinforcing mechanism. They just let you do it. And what's telling is that the music didn't seem to reinforce that anyone was having fun in the moment. We'll come back to this a lot, but it was down-tempo and miserable and increasingly paranoid, and the relationship melodrama was getting presumptuous and ugly and repetitive. And while there were some folks around the time using the words toxic masculinity in passing about this brand of rap or R&B, the true ramifications didn't seem to be sticking. After all, if you put Drake up against the allegations level for Kodak Black, XXXTentacion, and Tekashi 6ix9ine, seemed kind of easy to overlook him. Hell, I remembered more discourse directed at Kendrick Lamar for Humble and that Photoshop line than really anything Drake said in the late 2010s. That's very revealing in and of itself. And I know how clickbait works. When you have one of the most famous artists alive flagrantly stepping out of pocket so often where using his name would get you traffic, it's kind of revealing that many critics just shrugged and the internet largely did the same, let him become as big as he was. But that changed in 2018. When Pusha T fired the warning shot on Infrared from the album Daytona and then delivered the story of Adidon, one of the cruelest diss tracks in hip-hop until this last year. Now, I've always said that song deserved more attention for what wasn't the tea. The flip of Jay-Z's The Story of OJ for brutal recontextualization, drilling into questions of how Drake used and commodified culture, how he targeted cycles of familial neglect, ripping into Drake's faux nice guy image for all the hypocrisy it was and needed to be exposed. But let's be real, the line that moved the internet was, "You are hiding a child." And I hate that that became a thing online, that the only thing focused on was the tea spilled into the exasperating back and forth with Kanye West, that all it took was Drake's a deadbeat to really shift the conversation when the telltale signs are all over multiple albums. It was easy tabloid junk. It got the job done. Or did it? God's Plan and Nice for What were huge hits even after Drake definitively lost the fight. And then In My Feelings ruled the summer and Drake was still putting out guest contributions that supercharged careers. But if you were paying attention, you could tell the fan base was changing, especially in online spaces. Drake at this point was too big that he effectively hit silent majority status, too big to fail. That tends to transcend gender, but for rare cases. But the people who were loudest in his corner started to be overwhelmingly male. Kind of ironic ironic given how said fanbase would often mock other acts for not getting bitches, when if you went outside at all was often furthest from the truth. But this would continue into the 2020s, and it seemed like there were even fewer ideas in the tank. It was still so repetitive, where even if you were supposed to laugh at Drake online, the jokes were just getting less funny, and the rumors are still swirling about burn relationships and embassy parties. But truth be told, you can only win the internet for so long. Eventually, there's going to be someone who is just as mimetic who's going to come up and challenge you, and when the internet, irony poisoned yet again, will look to turn the tables on someone wearing out their welcome, it takes us to...
No friends in the industry, my brothers been my brothers, man. You niggas ain't no kin to me, a fact. Whoa, yeah, you heard about me, you don't know me more than that. Yeah, I know hey.
So this is where we enter speculative territory by necessity. As much as everyone likes to think they've got all the answers from behind the scenes, they don't. And I include Drake himself in that. But when the critical acclaim is gone and the internet is always fickle, the one element where Drake could persistently hang his hat in the late 2010s was commercial dominance. That even if he was jumping from scene and accent to scene and accent to keep relevant in the same way so many pop stars have gone before him, the album bombs across the Hot 100 could not be matched, built by a business juggernaut that even among those faking their streams and bundling their packages, Drake seemingly could not be stopped. And again, if Drake was responsible for handing so many of their acts their commercial breakthrough or greatest hit, surely he was the engine that made it all go, right? Well, this is where it gets a bit murky, because this has always felt more like conjecture than actual reality. Yeah, he's put on artists, often in their come up or when they're ready for the commercial crossover, but how much of that was him or them? Was he opening the doors, or were the doors already opening? If his formula was so golden to mint the charting hits, why doesn't OVO have the roster to follow in Young Money's footsteps? And why hasn't there been any collaboration series of mixtapes or EPs to further put them on? If Drake's eye for talent was so good, why did it often seem like the whole Drake stimulus package rarely gave the acts more than a single moment? And why were so many of the acts kind of mediocre at best? Many would highlight that Drake was just leeching off of acts to get a moment and move on, work it out on the remix as it were. But I think there's just as much truth in highlighting how being a good artist does not translate to being a good businessman or executive. And that's not unique to Drake. Branding can only hold up so long when some of the business fundamentals are kind of shoddy. Let's not ignore that Drake's initial deal with Young Money was also exploitative in the same way Wayne's was. And in the early 2010s, Drake worked his ass off to get as far away from it however possible. It was built into the run-up of, if you're reading this, it's too late. And like his idol Jay-Z, he often put in his bars when he's looking for the re-up in the next contract negotiation in order to build up popular hype around him. And for the most part, he seemed to get it. And more, especially in streaming deals that hit their zenith, with the playlist makers dumping his entire albums on their playlist, and especially with Scorpion being plastered everywhere to an obnoxious degree. But as we got into the 2020s, something with the business seemed to change, seemingly right around that $400 million deal he reportedly got from Universal in early 2022, an unparalleled amount of money that seemed to indicate Drake would have the flexibility and freedom to do really whatever the hell he wanted, where for his next project he would be making a house album that then underperformed for all intents and purposes. And indeed, Honestly Nevermind is the sort of project that prompts a lot more discourse for what it was trying to do outside of the music rather than the music itself. A fork in the road that has me wondering to this very day if Honestly Nevermind had been received better, whether Drake would be in this state right now. If he kept making us dance, wave our hands, whether a threat might even be on the table. Now, there were other factors in play, of course. Going toe-to-toe with Beyonce's Renaissance seemed to be the mother of bad timing, almost seemed to have him set up to fail on pure sonic artistry, but this was also the first tangible artistic risk that Drake had taken in years, and the audience largely rejected it outside of Jimmy Cooks with 21 Savage as the one rap song heralding what was to come, a very cynical one at that. That would lead to her loss. and For All the Dogs, and Scary Hours 3. All bad projects, but Her Loss is atrocious and spoke to the ugly rot now well entrenched in Drake's music. We'll get into this a bit later, but it seemed like few were asking that big question. If Drake just signed a $400 million deal, why did he just have to put out 5 projects in 3 years? Why did he seem to be on tour constantly? What sort of recouping did he have to do for Universal, and in what time frame? If he owned his masters in some form in the new deal, shouldn't he have more opportunities to leverage those masters in commercial placements? Why did Rick Ross, of all people, seem to have the gall to suggest Drake didn't have nearly as much money or specifically liquidity as he said he did? And in a not unrelated note, why was Drake doing gambling live streams affiliated with Stake? Look, I bring all this up because it highlights that after the mid-2010s and especially in the 2020s, it becomes questionable how much of Drake's success was determined on his talent and clout versus, well, how much the labels thought they could win on a very big investment with all the promo they were giving him in the world, especially when Drake's cultural cachet felt all the more shaky post-Pusha T. I mean, sure, when you are a silent majority act, they're gonna move ridiculous numbers of units, more than the internet says they ever should. See Morgan Wallen if you want the biggest example of this, country music's own version of Drake. But if honestly Nevermind had showed there was a market for Drake experimenting outside of rap and R&B, making electronic music, Universal might have seen that Drake had more time, more gas in the tank, more ideas, and Her Loss wouldn't have sounded so slapdash and rushed and fucking terrible, and For All the Dogs wouldn't have tried to so desperately to win back women who, after Her Loss, weren't exactly looking to come back as this is how they were getting treated and talked about. And then Scary Hours 3 was trying to win back the die-hard rap purists who were alienated by For All the Dogs. At least to me, this screams short-term profit-seeking, a label trying to recoup whatever they can before the shelf life runs out, and Drake was taking the deal because, well shit, it's $400 million. Even if there are terms applied and no ownership attached, how many could really turn that down? Especially if you're short on ideas, and you lost an entire gender of your diehard fan base, and you just so happen to really need the money for, well, other reasons. Now, this is where we could go down a rabbit hole around Drake's big attempted moves around Universal and a potential ownership question tied to Gamma, a company founded by former Interscope and Apple executive Larry Jackson, and specifically built to prioritize black culture. Both Sexy Red and Forbats are signed over there, as are Rick Ross and French Montana. And you know, isn't it odd that they seemingly now have bad blood with Drake in particular, that it might be linked to this connection? Where if cultural and currency is seeming strained or friendships tarred by someone fucking their girls, they might have something to say with that certain someone then taking a chunk of their earnings. Now, this is not an independent observation or conspiracy from me. Joe Budden connected all those dots during that fateful week in 2024 when he was trying to explore on his podcast why seemingly everyone was mad at Drake all of a sudden, including many of Drake's old friends or people you wouldn't expect to be mad at anyone. But it's context I couldn't escape post Kendrick Lamar, how one of Drake's biggest collaborations was You My Everything with Sexy Red. It places the lawsuit he filed against UMG in a different context. When an artist sues their own label just over 2 years after getting $400 million, even if Kendrick Lamar thoroughly humiliated him and they might be implicated, it also implies someone's trying to get out of their contract after taking a bad deal they only now realize had heavier strings, where bridges appeared to be thoroughly burned because the industry didn't take Drake's side, which became all the more obvious at the Grammys and Super Bowl, which it has to ask how many people he's alienated. I mean, many were operating with the assumption that Drake wanted more leverage within UMG, or one final paycheck to shut him up before he exposes the fraud of streaming in an open court of law, ignoring his own, but the fans operating that with the assumption he still has all that clout to do it. But honestly, Occam's razor, I think it's more likely he just needs the money. Or hell, he could always hop over to an act on his Vanity label with whom he's got some chemistry and a history, and sure as hell's not going to say no to a collaboration that'll lead to the most charting success he's ever had, with the distribution through a different major label. Maybe that's the power move if there's still a chance to regain that female fan base. Except, well...
Hey. Yo.
I remember seeing the defense of Her Loss in 2022, and something really stuck for me in the moment. It was a sentiment of, look, just let us have this. He's been off his game for so long, paying no attention to how we defended those older albums. This is the closest thing to getting there. And what struck me is that it was both more and less true than we've realized. Or rather, it was true to certain diehard fans in a way that's profoundly revealing of what they were willing to excuse because they saw it was always there to some real extent. And this is where I potentially wade into hostile waters. I don't like mocking fan bases of certain acts, partially because I have no room to talk, but also because the psychoanalysis of a fan base so large as Drake's, it's not going to be comprehensive, even if the loudest elements have spent a few years, but especially 2024, humiliating themselves online. And not for nothing, as much as FD Signifiers I'm What the Culture Feeling is a comprehensive video exploring the intertwining legacies of Drake and Kendrick Lamar, that segment midway through where he highlights that if Drake is your favorite rapper and you connect with him on a deeper level beyond just a couple songs you like or when you can turn up in the club, he says you're probably a loser or the most boring of your peers or might have some sketchy opinions around women. And I mean, I get where it's coming from in the culture, who's someone who's got a tangible distaste for Drake who's now taken the victory lap, but it also feels like a hot and incomplete take. The word he should have added was nowadays. Although, if we're being truly honest with ourselves, how much that statement rings true traces back even further than a lot of fans want to admit. Because that's the tricky thing when it comes to fandom, or in this case, standom, and where you draw the line between what you're willing to accept or excuse versus where you have to exit the conversation for everyone's good. And as an early, lukewarm Drake fan at best, I can give myself a lot of credit going back to my review of Views and hopping hard off that train, but this is a tougher conversation for all those who aren't critics. If you choose to marinate in the fandom of an artist for years on end, where you recognize deep cuts and demos and know the names and backstories of everyone he's tied to and all the Easter eggs, especially for an artist who is intentionally so revealing and messy of their personal lives, an artist craving validation at that for it, and you find a kinship in that honesty, well, it can start a cycle of enablement that only gets uglier the longer you stay in it. And that's made all the easier if the artist just so happens to be bankrolled by the biggest label on the planet. I don't like that popularity is often a driving factor as to why so many people like art, sometimes just for the social element, but just as often for someone epitomizing through creative expression an emotion or experience you want to live through. Well, look, I get it. And in my old video essay, We Don't Want to Talk About Separating the Art from the Artist, I highlighted that fundamentally emotional experience that folks really don't want to explore. Factor in the social cost of exiting fandoms or the sunk cost fallacy, and you will understand why so many fans will stoop so low to defend their favorites, especially when they're going off the deep end. And Drake fans are no exception. But it gets even uglier than that. Because for as much as I've highlighted that women have left Drake's fanbase in droves by the late 2010s, especially black women, there were plenty of reasons as to why, most of which came from Drake's own mouth and his own behavior. When he wasn't creeping on Rihanna or mentioning the girl in every beef, he has to imply there's a history between him and her, and Lord knows how many women by name he shouted out in increasingly creepy, concern-trolling, or condescending vibes, and there's the ones he's only implying but everyone figured out. There was initially a sense that Drake knew none of this was good. It's a cycle that was not built to last. One of the reasons Marvin's Room is such a potent song is because of how uncomfortable it is for Drake, the woman he's calling drunk, and the audience seeing something so messy and raw. And when that was paired with many songs that were acutely aware early on that the fame would not last, it was easier to contextualize, a little easier to swallow, but then he stuck around. He kept sticking around. The vibes only seemed to get worse. And the self-awareness in the framing started slipping away, even as the excuses were as loud as ever and he got older. And all the ugly rumors weren't slipping away because the internet does not forget. And it wasn't as if Drake was maturing in his content so much as being enabled to continue down this path. It's what the fan base wanted. He chose to do this. And at some point, if the same bad shallow hookups keep happening because you won't go to therapy or date someone your own age, or even just get over the fact that your longest crush has well and truly moved on, fuck a rap battle. That's a long life battle with yourself. Now, this is where I could just cite significant portions of my Certified Lover Boy review / my Donda review, the prosperity gospel, the extreme wealth Nietzschean framing where might makes right and you shouldn't deny yourself your baser instincts once you have all that power, drenched in the ugliest paranoid machismo that feels like a blanket cover from raging insecurity, where it doesn't really matter what level of irony you're on and what culture gets fed into the gristmill because you're making cash hand over fist. Irony is not a deflection from consumption, and plausible deniability only works to benefit you, where you stop caring about downstream emotional impact because quantity overpowers quality, and capitalism ensures innovation is less profitable than just giving people what they want over and over again. But I don't think I emphasize enough how miserable a fucking experience it is, and not just for Drake. At least in the mid-2010s, there were bangers or a hope of crossover, where the music might be strong enough to coat over some of the misogyny as just escapism. But by the 2020s, we didn't even get that, and became very emblematic of experiences within the modern manosphere. A lot of men complaining loudly and wrongly about women with their bastardized hierarchies, insecurity papered over with endless repetition, the occasional woman brought on board where the chemistry felt non-existent, and her experiences crushed into being just a statistic, a thick undercurrent of skeezy exploitation, and everyone's getting older and more miserable in the grift along the way, where there's less talk of the joys of sex and good company or even liking women, so much as endless projection trying to win the approval of other men. On a base level, engaging with this topic leaves you feeling hollow and fundamentally empty, because if you find a fulfilling relationship, you'd have no reason to go back to this shit. And on some level, that grift knows that. And maintaining the same low-effort content cycle is more lucrative than being creative, even if it's hellish to live within that scene or comment on it. And I speak from very early and personal experience there. When I did a video in 2014 trying desperately to find common ground with that scene pre-Gamergate, willing to give them any benefit of the doubt, thinking about the benefit of a collective men's movement at the time, well, I got hit with a harassment campaign courtesy of influencers from that era who are not relevant enough to be named now, and way too cowardly to engage with me past or present. Seems very telling that it reflects the same whirlpool of toxic sludge that they marinate in now a decade later, but then I see DJ Academics' own mewling amidst his allegations, and Drake doing streams with Aiden Ross. Now, you've all probably noticed by now, I didn't bring up any of the heavier allegations around Drake from Kendrick Lamar, even if I've kind of alluded to them. Or for as someone from Toronto, none of them were surprising, down to the reality that Drake would never be charged for it because of connections and protections, both legal and otherwise in this city. But the reason why is that when you look at the people around Drake and in that scene, which has festered, and in the manosphere scene as a whole, the allegations seem to come with the fucking territory. It's why Drake's misogyny has been generally accepted by the public at large. The fact that her loss was not ripped to shreds on that basis was even praised is extremely revealing to me, but his version of the Heart Part 6 wound up getting rejected. We saw Who You Run With. The whole line, "I'm too famous," could never land because your modern fame and fan base is fundamentally rooted in that same cultural backlash to progressive movements seeking to hold powerful men like you to account. But also how rare success is in that arena. And everyone knows that, including the manosphere who love to scream otherwise, but can't bear the sight of losing. It's also why Drake can't play any defense in this beef, because this sort of machismo is undercooked, fragile at its core. And I'm convinced the biggest reason Drake lost to Kendrick is that the internet values strength and winners more than it values culture, women, quality, and even good business. Not that it stopped the manosphere goons that try to prop him up, or rather target his presumed adversaries with some increasingly gross, weird, and just fucking racist attacks. Well, that goes against logic, good taste, common sense. So let's try to tie it all together with a question. One that might seem naive, but I do believe the vast majority of folks could be redeemed, and yeah, it includes Drake. If he was going to put out another album, how could he make it work? Well, on paper, Some Sexy Songs for You seems like it could make sense. Win back enough R&B cred among critics, go back to that territory, maybe by working with someone from your hometown to reestablish regional focus, rely on whatever commercial cachet you have, probably more with your collaborator's label than the one you're suing, and maybe lower the stakes with the public and the internet. Try to keep it more niche. I don't know, maybe make it shorter. Focus on serving the old audience you desperately want to win back, particularly women. Keep it with sounds and producers you know, and maybe, just maybe, show a little growth, maturity, or some of that old self-awareness in the framing. After all, you're 38 years old, and you've sounded checked out for albums now. Surely this could be a moment to reckon with all of that, build a new foundation, settle old scores, maybe some old debts? The possibility is there? Well, quite obviously, if you've heard the album, it didn't do that. It's bloated and feckless and tedious, and that's before we get into the genre hopping into alternative R&B with more than a few 2000s throwbacks, hopping on more trends. And if you thought the cultural appropriation was gone, there's the grab from regional Mexican, where Drake can't even pretend this is more than a flailing grab for something, anything to stick. Like with Her Loss, PartyNextDoor feels like the extended guest rather than a proper partner in the way that 21 Savage was. And Drake's singing can't approach where he was at his early peak, the production's painfully slapdash, and it just all still feels so dour, lacking any sense of joy. The Melissa Ford line shows that he's still shooting at his rivals through women, and it's a bad sign that the whole "Gimme a Hug" reminded me way more of the Drake and Josh memes alongside an era of dudes at clubs who love to ask for hugs. All the more creepy when you're nearly 40 and still going to those clubs. But the most revealing song here for me, Die Trying. It's a deep cut, where Drake talks about drinking with his father, recognizing he's falling in the exact same cycle of bad relationships as they describe all the girls as hoes who don't love him. And it's a very brief, lucid moment where Drake seems to realize his future might not be so bright. That's one song amidst 21 songs. And it's such a flicker, you realize there's no change, there's no evolution coming, and there's only so much that can be done to help someone who is at the top per se, who also won't help himself. And I'll be blunt, it's gonna move units on some of Drake's silent majority audience, but I don't think this is gonna snap the tailspin. If anything, it feels like a half measure that ultimately might make it seem worse. I don't see this winning back women when it feels like the songs are more interested in impressing other men with the conquest, and caught between playing to a small-scale niche audience with limited quality. I don't think the PartyNextDoor fans are that impressed with this from what I can tell on their side, but also swinging for crossovers in, quite frankly, humiliating fashion. There's no crossover hits here. There's no momentum. And if the internet is looking for an easy target and every reason to savage this along with plenty of critics, you could go ahead. Truth be told, if this was a review, it's gonna be a negative one, but it also wouldn't be that far removed from my last decade of negative Drake reviews. What would even be the point? It's also clear that this was intended to stop the bleeding, but Drake hasn't even processed why he was bleeding in the first place, or the necessary steps to heal himself, especially as it feels rooted in thinking that what he's done nothing wrong in recent years. Otherwise, he wouldn't have mentioned Baka on the album. Drake says on Gimme a Hug that he's not ready to settle down or get in a long-term relationship, and you know what? I agree with him. He's not done the work on himself to do so. I wouldn't want to put any partner through him, but that's also not surprising either. So what did we learn? Well, a couple things. I think we observed that if your diehard female fan base that you spent years cultivating is running in the opposite direction of you, your vibes are probably rancid, you should probably take care of that, and that would extend to the people idolizing you, the misogyny tourists who are only going to make things worse for you long term. I think we observed that the gatekeepers of culture need to be a lot better at their jobs, if not blocking his way, then guiding him to a better path, some level of artistic development, even if, or especially if, his cultural ties are shaky and could use that education or reinforcement. I think we observed that modern late capitalism has no interest in innovation when they can sell you back the same enshittified slop of previous years, and if we're not going to challenge the system in any larger manner, we might as well be better consumers, move the hell on, both in the attention economy and otherwise. I think we also observe the stark limits of ironic deflection in any sort of media consumption, and the stark limits of vulnerability taken to shamelessness commodified, and how when the internet makes it all a joke, it only gets worse, especially when the commodities are still getting consumed. But most importantly of all, I think we observed if the conversation between artist and audience is serving the worst appetites of both, where there's seemingly no end in sight as it spills beyond just art and into the cultural biases that enable said rot. I don't know, folks. I think you need to clear the tape.
You hot shit, taking half of everything you get. Yeah, them niggas ain't dying for you. Them niggas ain't dying for you.